Hi all, and welcome to part 2 of lesson 4, where we turn our attention to William Shakespeare's play, his great tragedy, King Lear. As I mentioned at the start of part 1, this is our second look at the genre of drama, and this is the first time we're taking a second look at a specific genre. So part of our discussion today will focus on how drama has changed from the last time we studied it at its genesis or its birth in ancient Athens, the city-state from ancient Greece where drama was born. So you could say that Renaissance drama, that's the literary movement or the time period in which Shakespeare was writing, the Renaissance, sometimes called the early modern period, was the next great big epoch for drama, the next big evolutionary step for drama as a genre. So we'll look at what were the specific innovations and things that Shakespeare and his contemporaries did that pushed drama forward, and what are maybe the similarities to the ancient Greeks. What do they draw on from the ancient Greeks? And we'll look in particular at King Lear, because this is an incredibly powerful play. As you can see the image here of Lear, realizing Cordelia has passed, carrying her body in that final scene, Act 5, Scene 3, incredibly powerful, tragic scene. I've used that image here, and it's also our image for our Canvas site for the class, because I think this is just such a powerful play. I'm very excited to discuss it with you. It is very, very tragic, so I hope you braced yourself properly, and we'll discuss the bleakness, the tragic, very tragic nature of it in our discussion. Also, a quick reminder, since this is a really complex text, easily by far the most complex text we've studied so far, I'm asking you to do 2 discussion board questions on it, but you don't have to do any discussion board questions for part 1 of this lecture, since that portion was on writing, helping you prepare for the first paper. So in other words, both questions for this week, because you always do 2 questions, are on Lear. And also this particular lecture that I'm about to give will be longer than normal for a lecture of just one text, because it is so complex. But even then, I'll still be scratching the surface. It's that complex. So there'll be plenty left for you to do on the discussion board. And that's always my favorite part. But without further ado, let's get to it. So some background on specifically Shakespeare and more generally the Renaissance period. This is, several thousand years after the ancient Greek period where drama was born in the city-state of Athens. And so this is about a little over 500 years, almost 600 years from where we are now. So much closer to present day than when we last studied drama, but still very far removed from the world we live in now. And later on in the quarter, we'll look at one last play, and we'll look at modern drama. But what was going on at this time, and what did Shakespeare and his contemporaries, other playwrights, do that was so significant for drama? One very important thing you should know is that Queen Elizabeth, who lived from 1533 to 1603, was the ruler most of the time Shakespeare was writing. She ruled from 1558 to 1603, and he wrote most of his plays at the end of the 16th century, start of the 17th century, a few of his later works after 1603, but the majority of them during her reign. And they call it Elizabethan England. That was just a very unique time in British history. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that made that a unique time for England. One of them was the Protestant Reformation. Now, I could spend a whole lecture on the Protestant Reformation, because in terms of the evolution and history of Western society and culture, the Protestant Reformation is one of the most influential events of all time. But I'll sum up by saying that it was essentially a break with the Pope and a break with Catholicism where most countries throughout Europe, including Britain at this time, were subject to the authority of the Pope because they were Catholic. And so he ruled from the Vatican. And then Martin Luther and later John Calvin were two of the forerunners. And there were all kinds of problems, all kinds of abuses in the Catholic Church. And the big thing was that the average person could not read the Bible, not only due to illiteracy, but moreover because the Pope didn't want people to have the Bible. Because if some of the popes were so bad, some of them were like mob bosses, essentially, if you study some of this history. And so the corruption would be harder for it to carry on if people were able to, the average person, the average churchgoer, were able to read the Bible and say, hey, this contradicts what the Bible says about church leadership and authority. And so Luther translated the Bible, or helped to get others translated the Bible, and he helped get access to it, spread it to people. And the printing press was also invented at this time. So this led to huge upheaval and change. And it made greater religious freedom was one of the results. But there were also side effects. And one was that monarchs, like the King or Queen of England, for instance, were no longer subject to the Pope's authority. So Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, broke with the Catholic Church because he wanted to get a divorce, because he believed his wife could not conceive a male heir, and he really wanted a male heir. And he was married a number of times. You've probably heard the old phrase, like the 6 wives of Henry VIII. I forget how many women off the top of my head exactly he married, but he was never able to produce a male heir that was able to succeed to the throne, and so Elizabeth became queen. So what really is important to take away from these things is that there was a relative amount of religious freedom in Britain at the time Elizabeth was ruling and Shakespeare was writing, but that it was a very strange time because many people, average everyday people, not rulers, went from being Catholics to being Protestants and the span of their own lifetime. So there was tension between Catholicism and Protestantism, but a relative amount of religious freedom under Elizabeth. And you have to keep in mind another factor here is that England was still a relatively small country and a relatively new country because it had been a number of tribes that only a few hundred years before this had coalesced into one nation. By contrast, Spain was the world power at this time. It was the largest empire, conquering much of what we now call Latin America and South America. It had an incredible navy, a powerful armada, and not far from England, right? So England actually clashed with the Spanish Armada several times. And even though England was smaller, they won, which is quite impressive. And they were a relatively new country, as a unified country, at least compared to Spain. And eventually, the power of the Spanish Empire would wane, and several hundred years from now, in the 19th century, the British Empire would become the largest empire the world has ever seen, even larger than ancient Rome. But it takes several hundred years for that to happen. So this time, when Elizabeth is ruling and Shakespeare is writing, England is this fledgling Protestant, so that's unique, nation that's able to hold its own against Spain. And so people really, at the time, Queen Elizabeth was beloved. She was a great leader who united her country and helped, push them forward at a time of uncertainty. She helped England solidify itself as a small but heroic Protestant nation. But there was still continued fear of Spanish invasion because Spain was so powerful, and there were actually Catholic plots against Elizabeth, since relative amount of religious freedom compared to other rulers under Elizabeth, but because the nation was technically Protestant thanks to the efforts of her father, and there was all this tension between Catholics and Protestants, you had fear both within, of Catholic uprising and fear from without Spanish invasion. And so it was a small, fledgling, the heroic nation was how people thought of it, but that peace was very tenuous. And so these are, because we have sort of a fictional older England presented to us in King Lear. This is the backdrop for that Shakespeare has in his play. And so by setting the story in the past, but in the same country, he can make it a story that speaks to the things going on at that day. And so the key takeaways here are he's speaking to this idea of a small but strong, tenuous nation. What were some other things going on at this time, perhaps more broadly beyond England in the Renaissance, that would have been influential to Shakespeare's writing? One is the Protestant Reformation, which I've already mentioned. Two, which I mentioned just in passing, is the invention of the printing press, which was huge because that brought literature and writing to people all throughout the world who didn't have access to it before at a very rapid pace. So the Protestant Reformation, the invention of the printing press, also the exploration of what these people in Europe called the New World, but was actually a much older world. People able to travel abroad to places like Latin America, South America, and meet people and cultures they never met before. And so all of these things, the religious reform, new technology that makes reading and writing more accessible, and then meeting new people and new cultures, all of this led to a period of widespread revolutionary change and introspection in literature. So the period prior to this, the medieval period, had been a period with more of an outward focus in literature. Here we have what we call introspection or interiority. So the psychology of the characters in Lear and other dramas was very important. So there was an individualistic focus that hadn't been there before as people's worlds exploded. All these modern things, religious freedom, new technologies, exploration of parts of the world they had not explored before, all of this kind of exploded their minds. And so there was this very, focus on how is the changing world around us changing us as individuals, all kinds of introspection in literature. Let's take a last couple bullet points here and look specifically at drama. So the Globe was the theater in London where Shakespeare's plays were performed, and it was open to all social classes, which was incredibly unique because literature had been part of like the highbrow portion of society. In the middle classes and the working classes, they most of them were illiterate, and like I was saying on my Protestant Reformation point, they didn't have the opportunity to read. They didn't even have access to the material in most cases. But drama, much like it did in ancient Athens, became the most popular form of entertainment because you didn't have to be able to read to see it. You could go see it performed. And there hadn't been an explosion of this much drama being performed anywhere in the world, really, in between ancient Athens and Renaissance London. But now you have it. And they had seats in the pit at the bottom of the theater called the penny seats. So pretty much anybody could go. It was so cheap. I mean, you had the wealthier people up high above, but people of all social classes were there. And so writers and performers during this time were just churning out dramas left and right. And so that's one of the reasons why this is such an important period for studying drama. And because Shakespeare is arguably the greatest dramatist of all time, and he produced his works during this period. Now, there's a lot of debate about the identity of Shakespeare. We know very little about his biography. I haven't even included his biography on this slide, which normally I would. And so there's a whole society of very legitimate scholars who argue that William Shakespeare was not actually the author of the plays. And there's some legitimate evidence to support that. Now, I haven't done enough research into it myself to know where I stand on that issue, but I haven't really done that research because I don't feel it's that important. What we have are the plays, and the plays themselves are important. And whether Shakespeare or someone else wrote them, the plays are the same. And so when I'll use the phrase throughout this lecture, what is Shakespeare communicating here? And I don't really mean Shakespeare the man. I mean whoever the author may be, the mind behind this text. I'm just using Shakespeare's name to keep that simpler. So keep that in mind, that when I talk about a message or an argument or an idea the text is presenting. If I mention the author's name, I'm really just saying the text is presenting this idea. Finally, Shakespeare's works, if he was indeed the author, he passed away in 1616, and no other plays attributed to William Shakespeare were produced after that year. Some of them were produced in what we call quarto editions, which were like little pamphlets as they were performed, but most of them weren't published until after he passed away in 1623 in what we call the first folio edition. And this is relevant to our discussion because in the quarto edition that was published around the time Lear was performed, it was one of the few plays that was published in quarto form. Albany becomes king at the end. But in the version that's considered the authoritative one that we're reading, that was published after Shakespeare's death in the folio in 23, Edgar becomes king. And so I think that's an important question we'll come back to. Which would be a better king? And I think we can ask it, since at least in one version, the writer or writers intended it to be Albany rather than Edgar. So hopefully this is some background that really fleshes out what drama was like at the time and what the cultural backdrop was, so that you can consider how drama has evolved since the time of ancient Athenian drama that we studied in lesson 1. There are a lot of themes or threads to pull on, so I'm going to list them here, and it'll be a lot, so you might jot them down as notes, maybe pause the lecture, but in all of the close reading I do, we'll consistently come back to each of these themes in a variety of ways, so it will be easier to keep track of them than it might initially seem from looking at this slide. First up is what I just mentioned, the evolution of drama from ancient Greece to the Renaissance. That's very important here, than perhaps, and always important, but perhaps more important here than in other studies of Lear, because this class is introduction to genre. So we're going to look at how has it drawn on the sources, the ancient Greeks, how has it evolved from them, and we'll ask those same questions in our third iteration of drama in a few weeks. Particularly, though, I'm concerned with the pursuit of catharsis here, not only because that's our theme for the class, but because the idea of catharsis was essentially born with Oedipus, our first drama we studied from ancient Athens, and moreover, this is a tragedy, just like Oedipus. They're all other kinds of plays, comedies, history plays, etc. I tend to think drama is the most powerful, or tragedy is the most powerful, and since we have very limited time in this class, because it's only a 10-week class, and we're studying, the 4 biggest genres of writing, we're focusing mainly on tragedy here. But many scholars argue that Shakespeare's plays emulate, to a certain degree, the dramatic structure, that Sophocles developed and that Aristotle outlined. And so to what degree does the structure of this play, the narrative structure in particular, resemble Oedipus, and to what degree is catharsis a part here, is a very important question. And several prominent themes from Oedipus are utilized by Shakespeare here. And so those are the next 3 bullet points. So the first being irony. We remember how important irony was in Oedipus, right? The idea, as one example, that he tries to run away from the prophecy, but because he doesn't know the true nature of his parentage, he ironically runs right toward it. That's essentially the invention of what we call literary irony, not a coincidence. That's something you expect to happen, the opposite happens. No, literary irony is what is actually happens in the text is different from what seems to be happening or characters think is happening. We had the birth of literary irony with Oedipus. Now we have it explored further in Lear, because often, some of the things seem to be going on, actually the opposite is. And so Shakespeare, like Sophocles, uses irony to great effect. Pride is also a theme carried on from Oedipus. Oedipus's pride was his refusal to listen to the advice of others, which made the reception of the tragic news even more tragic. When Tiresias and eventually Jocasta were saying, hold back, don't hear this, Oedipus pushed on further for the truth. That was his pride. Here, we have pride in a different way, because Lear's pride is the demand to be worshipped. He says to his daughters, I want you to praise me publicly, in front of Kent and Gloucester and the others present. He wants a public display of affection. Essentially, he wants to be worshipped, which is, you could argue, one of the greatest tragic flaws of all time, maybe the most original one. And it precipitates the downfall. Everything that happens in this incredibly tragic and bleak play happens because Lear believes he needs the praise of humankind. He needs to be praised in public. So pride is very important, but it's a flaw or sin we see in Oedipus in a different way. We see it here in perhaps a more fundamental way. And the third of the themes that carries on from Oedipus is blindness. Gloucester's eyes are blinded here, and Lear and Gloucester are both figuratively blinded to the realities of their children and what their children, who their children are, what their moral character of their children is. So blindness is very important in all three of these themes, but I think particularly blindness in relation to Oedipus, because that's a little more unique. Irony and pride are used more widely in all kinds of texts and dramas. It's very interesting to see how Shakespeare uses it and develops it throughout the course of the play in comparison to how Sophocles does in Oedipus. Okay, a few more important themes here that we'll look at. Madness. Madness is an important theme all throughout Shakespeare's work. A very similar kind of use of madness in one of his other most famous tragedies, Hamlet. So it was something he used consistently and frequently throughout his work. He really wanted to explore the interior of the human mind, like I mentioned on the last slide. But to connect this theme to irony, you have madness and reason, which we'll talk more about when we study Edmund's character, and reason and madness in Lear, and wisdom and folly with the fool. And so we'll explore this in more detail, but just real quickly, you're probably thinking, what do I mean? So here's what I mean. Edmund, as we'll talk more about in a few slides, is the epitome of rational thinking. He all of his machinations are plans he's worked out with logic that he thinks will work. But the things he's doing, when you look at them, seem insane, right? I mean, he's killing people. And so there's madness in his reason. Lear actually goes insane once he realizes the mistake he's made. But some of the wisest, most rational things he says while he's insane. And so Shakespeare is teaching us something here about reason and insanity and the limits of the human mind. And Edgar is also an example for reason and madness because he pretends to be insane and people see him as insane, but he's arguably the most stable character in the text. And he, again, like Lear, even though Lear is actually going insane for a while, Edgar does some of his most logical things while he's pretending to be insane. You have a moral or social order versus a natural order. This is a play that's particularly, compared to other dramas of the time, concerned with the environment and the natural world. And you have a social order that is subverted here. For instance, the social order would place Edgar above Edmund because Edmund is the bastard. But Edmund reasons out a plan that he thinks will work and almost works to gain power, to eventually become king, potentially. And it almost works. But he would normally never be able to do that because he's not of noble birth. So the natural order is usurping the social order, almost there. There's also a moral order, right? Like, we know that human beings have innate morals, but most of those are subverted or challenged or here. And so we'll see, like, what is the moral order, the social order, in a relationship to the natural order at the end of the play. Justice is also very important. This is a hard play, a hard pill to swallow sometimes, because even though the villains get what they deserve, a lot of the heroes experience fates worse than we think they should deserve. So another question we'll ask is, what is the play's view of justice? And that's a tough question to tackle, but an incredibly important one. Excuse me. There's also an idea of perseverance. Edgar, who I think is my favorite character in Lear, but one of the greatest characters in literature. Although this play is full of wonderful characters, so you may have your own favorites. He talks to his father specifically about endurance during times of pain and suffering, and he uses the phrase ripeness to inspire his father. And in an incredibly bleak play, the reason why I like Edgar's character is because of his perseverance, his endurance, and his belief in ripeness. So we'll talk more about that. Finally, this is a play about truth, because it all comes back to that original sin that leads to the downfall of the kingdom, which is Lear saying, give me praise in public. And so that's all artificial. That's flattery. That's veneer. It's not the truth. And Cordelia, her role in the downfall is she sticks to the truth. She says, I'm not going to flatter you for flattery's sake. And so truth is incredibly important. But when it's all said and done, when pretty much everybody is wiped out and we're at the conclusion of the play, what is the truth with which we're left? Well, I would argue that it's a fallen and broken world. Edgar is left standing, and I love Edgar, but is Edgar enough? Is Edgar enough to repair, restore, redeem the brokenness of the world we see? I don't think so. So what do we do with that? I know that's a bleak thought, but I don't want to tell you my answer to it now. Hold it in the back of your mind as we read. So a question you're probably wondering is, for such a long, complex drama, how am I going to unpack it on this next number of slides? Couple of things. One, I'm not going to do a plot summary. Even though it's complex and even though the early modern English of Shakespeare's time is hard to read, either you've also read the modern translation or you've read a summary or something. Like, my assumption is the plot is firm in your mind at this point. So covering it would be redundant and take up time in a long lecture. So if you feel like you're hazy on the plot at all, pause the lecture right now and go read, the paragraphs on Wikipedia that summarize the plot. But two, more importantly, I decided to look at 4 passages from the text, one for each of who I believe are the most important characters. This is a play where narrative and plot is very important, but characterization is probably equally, if not more important. So by studying Cordelia, studying Edmund, studying Edgar, and studying Lear, we can unravel most of those threads, most of those themes we just looked at, and get to what do we learn. Other characters, I do not mean to dismiss Regan or Goneril or Gloucester or Kent or even the Fool. They're all fascinating and important, but I think if you had to, forced to rank them, these are the 4 most important. These are the 4 we can learn the most from, and we only have so much time. And I've chosen to look at the quotes in chronological order. And so I'm looking at the characters in a sequence that I think will help us unravel the meaning of the play. In other words, when I choose to look at a certain character, for instance, we're going to look at Cordelia first. We're looking at her first because I believe her most pivotal moment happens in Act 1, Scene 1. Similarly, when we look at another character, for instance, we're going to look at Edmund after Cordelia. The scene we're looking at there, I believe that's one of the most pivotal defining moments for Edmund, and so on and so forth. And so we'll go chronologically. We'll look at Cordelia, then Edmund, then Edgar, finally Lear. And I think that the meaning, the message of the play will become clear through the course of this approach. So what are your impressions of Cordelia's character? My question will be phrased that way for each character. It's just kind of an excuse to get to a quote. And because this is such a complex play compared to other lectures, I'll have a number of bullet points after the quote that connect back to the themes we just looked at to tease out what is important from the quote and make that really explicit and clear. So this is Cordelia's response to to Lear's request to be praised publicly, to be flattered. She says, "Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty, according to my bond, no more nor less." So what's important here? Well, she refuses to do a number of things, and that's what's important. She refuses to quantify her love, because before this, Goneril and Regan say, "I love you this much, this many things." And so on the one hand, she's saying she loves her father so much that she's not going to quantify it, to put it in numbers, which shows that she does deeply love her father, which is the truth of this scene, right? This scene is absurd in a sense because Lear is asking people who don't love him to praise him, and someone whose love he should not question at all to praise him as well. And so, this shows how much she loves him, but it's not the public acknowledgement he's looking for, and so that angers him. She refuses to flatter for flattery's sake. So the truth is, Goneril and Regan are just using their father. They have no love for him, or they wouldn't be able to do the things they do to him later on if they did. Yet they're just heaping praise upon him. "Oh, your majesty." And it's so false. It's so fake. Cordelia is going to have no part of that. And I think that's what's beautiful about her character. There's a lot we can say about Cordelia, but critics and scholars have been puzzled some by her because she's featured in the play very little, despite how pivotal and how important she is to it. And I make the argument that she is so important because she represents the importance of truth. And I think this is a way the play is relevant today, because we live in a world where we're surrounded by fake news. And no matter which way we vote or what we believe, we can find people out there who want to tell us the lies we want to believe, and people on the other side of the spectrum who are also making up lies. And what do we read? And what do we believe? And people are also saying this is a post-truth era. Invent your own truth. But if we give up on truth, what do we have left? And this play illustrates that, because as soon as Lear forsakes Cordelia, he's forsaking the truth when he forsakes her. And as soon as he forsakes the truth, as soon as he forsakes Cordelia, everything falls apart. So this play illustrates the importance of truth, and we see that here when Cordelia refuses to flatter for flattery's sake. Another way of saying that would be she refuses to join in with a circle of liars, and she refused to bear false witness. Because one of the points she makes here, she says, "According to my bond, no more nor less." Goneril and Regan are married, and Cordelia knows she's about to be wed to one of two men. So she's about to be married. And, she's saying, "These gals, my sisters, are saying they love you more than anything." What does that say about their husbands? It means either one of two things. Either they're liars, which they are, or they don't really love their husbands, which is also basically true. So, she's saying, I'm not going to lie. If I try to praise you as much as my sisters, equally with my sisters here, that'll be unfair to my future husband. And so she's not going to do that. She's not going to lie. Some scholars say that Cordelia is in part responsible for the tragic downfall of the kingdom, because if she'd just gone along with this, it would have simplified everything. But if she'd just gone along with this, she would be bearing false witness. She would be lying. And so Cordelia exemplifies the truth and the importance of the truth and what happens when we give up on the truth and expel it from our lives. How about Edmund? I think the most pivotal scene for Edmund is shortly after the scene I just read with Cordelia, because it's where he first formulates his plan and first puts into motion his plan, and where he reasons, even though I'm a bastard, I can do this. "Thou, nature, art my goddess to thy law, my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines, lag of a brother, why bastard, wherefore base? Legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund, as to the legitimate. Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate, if this letter speed, and my invention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now gods stand up for bastards. So, have you ever heard the phrase legitimate used so many times in one passage? 14 lines or so. And he repeats it again and again throughout the text. So that distinction between Edmund and Edgar, that he's the bastard and Edgar is legitimate, it's the driving force behind all of Edmund's motivations. And Edmund is a truly Renaissance character. As I mentioned before, the Renaissance was this period of individuality, self-expression, and that was a relatively new concept. Most Western societies have been very community-based prior to the Renaissance. And so Edmund is this quintessential Renaissance character because he's individualistic and he wants to usurp the traditional order. Remember, I said it was a very traditional period. And so a character like Edmund could not have been written in the Western world prior to the Renaissance because he's like the ultimate version of the self-made man. He's able to almost become king, basically, through his own machinations, even though he's born in, not a noble birth. And so that's quite impressive and very much, a Renaissance kind of a thing. And it almost makes me want to sympathize with Edmund. He says, now gods, stand up for bastards. I feel sympathy for him here because he hasn't known the familial love that Edgar has known. But his actions are deplorable. So this gives us a lot to think about. Why would Shakespeare take a character, create some sympathy for him, and then have him do really horrible things? Shakespeare's really pushing us to think with Edmund's character, and that's why he's so important. He's also extremely rational. His plan is rooted in logic. If you strip away the social order, strip away the moral order, you just have the natural order. Why can't a bastard become king? There's no real difference between Edgar and I other than how we were born. And so Edmund has, the most sympathetic of motivations, but the most deplorable of actions. And I think part of what Shakespeare's communicating here is no matter how potentially noble our motivations, our actions still matter. Our actions speak louder than words. Our actions speak louder, perhaps, even you could argue, than motivations. And so the social order may be arbitrary, and Shakespeare might be challenging that, but the moral order, I think he's upholding that. Because if he wanted to throw out the moral order, Edmund, rather than Edgar, would be the hero of the play. But that's not the case. But the sympathy we do feel for him certainly makes us think. So to sum up, what are the things we have with Edgar here? Extreme rationalism, right? He reasons out this plan. But his plan involves killing people. So madness and reason. And in many ways, I think Shakespeare's questioning or challenging the values of his day, because he's saying not all good comes from this individualistic, self-focused, self-expressive approach here. Edmund commits horrible crimes. And so after the Renaissance, the period immediately following this was the Enlightenment, and that was a period where reason, above all else, was emphasized by scholars and philosophers and authors. And it's born right out of the Renaissance. The cause and effect transition to the Enlightenment is very clear. And so reason, rational thinking is also a part of the Renaissance. And Shakespeare's challenging that here, saying rational thinking is good, but when it's carried to an extreme, it looks like insanity. It becomes insanity. And that's what you have with Edmund. I already talked about Natural order over social or moral order. Edmund is trying to usurp not only the social order, which could be a good thing. I mean, bastards should be treated better, and that's why we have sympathy for Edmund. But because the only way he can achieve power is to lie, manipulate, kill, and abuse people, he's also usurping the moral order, and that's why he's not vindicated at the end. And so I think Shakespeare's arguing, there are problems with the social order, but that doesn't mean we can let go of the moral order. Things are wrong, and we need to do things about them. But killing or lying aren't ones that are acceptable. And he is the ultimate example of the self-made man. I think the self-made man is a great concept, and there's a lot we can do through our work and our actions, but ultimately we can't do it on our own. Ultimately, we need the help of others, and we'll fail without the help of others. And that's, part of why Edmund fails, in addition to the reasons I already mentioned, is he relies entirely on his own effort. So we've looked at Edmund. Let's look at his brother, his foil here, Edgar. And one of the most moving passages for me in all of literature is when Edgar saves his father's life by lying to him. And I've really emphasized the truth. So am I contradicting myself? What am I getting at here? But let's take a look at, what Edgar says to his father, where, there's a context here. His father's been blinded, and he's at the point of suicide because he's blinded and he knows he's made a mistake. He knows he was duped by Edmund, and just like Lear, Lear has gone insane because he realizes he was wrong. And now Gloucester is suicidal because he realizes he was wrong. He's physically blind. So Edgar's able to lie to him and say, hey, you did jump off the cliffs of Dover, and look, you survived. And that snaps Gloucester out of his depression here. This is what he says to him after he's pretending Lear has landed safely. Hast thou been aught but gossamer feathers air, so many fathom down precipitating? Thou'st shivered like an egg, but thou dost breathe. Hast heavy substance, bleeds not, speakest art sound? 10 masts at each make not the altitude which thou hast perpendicularly fell. Thy life's a miracle. Speak yet again. And a little bit later on, once Gloucester knows that Lear and Cordelia have been captured and will most likely be killed, but they haven't died yet, he slips back into depression and doesn't want to carry on. And Edgar once again pulls him out of it and says, you have to keep going. And this is what he says there. What? And ill thoughts again? Men must endure. They're going hence even as they're coming hither. Ripeness is all. Come on. So, with the first of these two passages, I said I've been emphasizing truth throughout this lecture. And Edgar lies here. Well, it's a different kind of a lie. I mean, I don't want to evade that. I'm not saying we just never ever lie. But there's a difference between, what Cordelia was asked to do and what Edgar was asked to do here. Cordelia was asked to do was to give someone, her praise, flattery just for the sake of flattery, for no other reason. It was a performance. Here, Edgar is performing, but he's teaching his father something. He's teaching him that miracles are possible. He's teaching him that no matter how bleak things get, we still have hope. And he doesn't know any other way to illustrate that. The guy is about to jump off a cliff. How do you show someone who's about to jump off a cliff that there's still hope? You make them believe in miracles. And if you can't produce a miracle yourself, you invent one. And Edgar invents one here. But is he really lying? He says, thy life's a miracle. I tell you, when I wake up every day, I say, thank you that I'm breathing. Thank you that my wife is breathing. Thank you that my kids are breathing. And just being able to breathe is something we overlook as humans, that we take for granted. And I'm not here breathing by any kind of a miracle. Or am I? I'm certainly not at the point Gloucester was at here. And there was nothing particularly threatening my life before I went to sleep the night before. But the fact that I'm even here, I think is a miracle. So Edgar's forging the truth here to teach his father something incredibly important for an incredibly important reason, to keep his father going, to endure, to persevere through the bleakness because of hope. So you have reason and madness. At this scene, Edgar's still wearing his disguise. He's still pretending to be a crazy person. But I argue this is, one of the most powerful scenes in the play, one of the most powerful scenes in all of literature. And he saves his father, even though he's dressed like a madman. And even though he lies, he perhaps communicates a greater truth than he would have by not lying here. And if Cordelia had lied at the beginning, there would have been no truth. The truth was completely absent from there. But in this scene, a greater truth is able to come forth. Thy life's a miracle. Men must endure. Ripeness is all. And so ripeness to me is the potential here to seize the moment, that we shouldn't give up hope no matter how bleak it is, because there can be something greater if we push ahead. That's the ripeness. And I think that's why Edgar is the key to the whole play and one of the greatest figures in all of literature, because of the ripeness, because of the perseverance, because of the endurance, because of the hope he brings in the bleakest of circumstances. Finally, Lear. So at the end of the play, Lear carries in Cordelia's dead body. Lear has done some really bad things. We might not think he should be punished to the extent that he is punished, but he's done some pretty bad things. Cordelia, I don't think there's any way we can see her death as acceptable. So we see how that affects him. How? Oh, you are men of stones. Had I your tongues and eyes, I'd use them so, that heaven's vault should crack. She's gone forever. I know when one is dead and when one lives. She's dead as earth. Lend me a looking glass. If that her breath will mist or stain the stone, why then she lives. This feather stirs, she lives, if it be so. It is a chance which does redeem all sorrows that ever have I felt. A plague upon you, murderers, traitors all. I might have saved her. Now she's gone forever. Cordelia, stay a little. Ha! What is thou sayest? Her voice was ever soft, gentle, low. An excellent thing in woman. I killed the slave that was a hanging thee. So at the beginning of this scene, he's howling like an animal. And there's this whole thing in the play going on where it's like human versus animal nature with Lear, especially when he's in his madness. Now, he's had a reprieve from his madness in the prior act, in Act 4, when he's reunited with Cordelia and sees she's still alive and doing well, thriving really with her husband and her army. But here she's dead. And so I don't know if he slips all the way back into insanity, but he's howling like an animal. And this is the howl. I love the howl here. It's like the ultimate expression of human grief. How grieved he is by Cordelia's death. Grieved to the point that he thinks she might still be alive. He thinks she stirs. What I've done here is looked at essentially Lear's final speech, and where you see the dots just cut out the interactions with the other characters. So he goes from howling over her death to thinking she might be alive, maybe she stirred, to eventually in the final section, mourning the things he loved about her, gentle and low, an excellent thing in woman. So it's like madness and reason and madness both displayed here. Something about the fact that she's clearly dead, but he's talking to her like she could still be alive. That's the same kind of a thing that happens when Edgar tells his father, "You jumped and you survived. It's a miracle." They're both not true. Gloucester didn't really jump. Cordelia's not really alive. But there's a beauty here that is true, even if Cordelia is not really alive. And it's the beauty of how much he did love her before he made that mistake. And showing us what we should all mourn as we read this, the loss of something beautiful that didn't deserve to die. Truth shouldn't have died. So what do we do here? We circle back to truth, right? Because he's holding and grieving over the form that represents truth. And Cordelia should not have died. We should be upset about that. That's why it's a tragedy. So what does the play teach us at the end? It teaches us that the world we live in, it's the same world hundreds of years later, but it's the same world as Lear and Cordelia and Edgar and Edmund and the other characters. And it is a fallen, broken world. And we can't escape that truth Shakespeare's teaching us. So the question isn't whether the world is broken or not, whether that's true or not. The question is, what do we do with the brokenness of the world? We'll come back to that in just a minute. We'll come back to that as our last discussion board question. First, I'm going to go over the other discussion board questions with you. I've given you double the amount since you have to write on 2 of them, and I probably could have assigned 20 more for this particular play. So I'll try to move through these quickly for you. Compare and contrast King Lear with Oedipus. This is the question that addresses the evolution of drama. So Lear and Oedipus, the play, not necessarily the character. That question will come later. The play with Oedipus, specifically and more generally Renaissance drama with ancient Athenian drama. What is similar? What is different? What has Shakespeare borrowed from ancient Athens? What has he added to the genre that's new? Why are these changes important? And why do they maybe reflect, how do they reflect the context of the time? Second up to bat is catharsis. So just all the questions that come with catharsis. What emotions does the play evoke? What did you feel while reading it? Do you feel like these emotions have been not just purged, but purified, made into something greater? This ending is incredibly bleak, but catharsis is one of the rare opportunities we have for hope or even wonder to come from the bleakness. Does that happen here or not? So how is catharsis worked out in Lear? And you can compare it to Oedipus if you want, though you don't have to for this particular question because we're studying catharsis with everything this quarter. Blindness is the third one. So again, kind of a compare contrast with Oedipus. How does Sophocles use blindness in Oedipus? How does Shakespeare develop it here? What are the similarities and differences? As always, what is important or significant about those similarities and differences? So number 1 is the comparison of ancient drama to Renaissance drama. Number 2 is catharsis. Number 3 is blindness. Now we're going to look at each of the 4 characters, Cordelia, Edmund, Edgar, Lear, and conclude with the brokenness of the world. So what do you think of Cordelia? And for hers, I kept the question kind of basic because, like I said, she's a challenging character that she's arguably the most important character, but doesn't actually appear in the play that much. So what do you think of her? Do you like her? Why or why not? What role does she play in the events? As I mentioned, she could have just gone along and kept things much simpler, but she doesn't do that, and I think that's important. And justice is, if you want to discuss the theme of justice, you could discuss it pretty much anywhere, but it makes a lot of sense to discuss it with Cordelia. And so what is the point? What is the point for Cordelia? Her fate is horrible. But Shakespeare's not just making her fate horrible for no reason. What is he trying to teach us with her character? And a couple of lessons ago, we talked about how some readers want to ban the Odyssey. Other readers actually want to ban Shakespeare. Shakespeare's being taught less and less. I think that's a travesty. I think there are things that are problematic in Shakespeare, and we need to be aware of those and look out for them. But I also think Shakespeare questions, challenges, and critiques many horrible things. His play Othello is a scathing attack against racism. His play The Merchant of Venice does something similar to that. His depictions of women are interesting. Arguably, Goneril and Regan are pretty terrible characters, and Cordelia is a very kind of minimalistic character, you could say. But I think there's much more going on here with his representation of women, Cordelia in particular, than what's on the surface. So those are some things you can think about if you want to write on Cordelia. Edmund, he's the most complex villain. Regan and Goneril, it's hard to have a lot of sympathy for them. But what do you think of Edmund? Do you sympathize with him? Why or why not? Is he more of an anti-hero or a villain? I want to hear what you think of Edmund. I'm giving you my take on Edmund. He's not simple for a reason. I want to read what you have to say about that. Edgar, the question I've chosen to give us kind of a way into Edgar's character is that with the context that in the Quattro version, Albany becomes king, but in the Folio version, which we have here, Edgar becomes king. So which do you believe would be a better king and why? I think Edgar's got a lot of potential. Love Edgar. I've told you I love Edgar. But I think just the fact that there's two versions raises the question, could anyone, even Edgar, be a good ruler for this kingdom? How broken is it? What is Shakespeare trying to show us with the final status of this kingdom here? You can go that way with this question, or you can more just talk about Edgar. It's pretty open-ended. I wanted to give you some food for thought. Lear. What do you think of him as a tragic hero protagonist? We've seen kind of what you could call this formative narrative structure for dramas where you have a character like Oedipus who's a revered character, has some stature we respect, who makes a mistake, who falls from grace, who realizes his mistake and then experiences this catharsis, which is in turn cathartic for the audience at the end. Again, a lot of scholars think that Shakespeare does that kind of a thing with many of his tragic protagonists. But does he do that kind of a thing with Lear? What do you think of Lear? Does he experience catharsis? Does he help the audience experience catharsis or not? Is he a great hero, a great protagonist? And he makes mistakes, but so does Oedipus. So does Othello. So do the great tragic figures of literary history. But you also really might not like him either, because what he does at the beginning is pretty horrible, and what he does leads to the downfall of the entire kingdom. There's a lot to unpack with Lear. Why not put two questions on one slide? It would have fit? No, it wouldn't have fit, because I want to read you the final lines of the play spoken by Edgar to inform this final question. The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest hath borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long. Kind of some sympathy from Edgar for Lear here, because he's the oldest, right? And the weight of this sad time we must obey. He is the character who says, persevere, endure, life's a miracle, ripeness. He's also saying the weight of this sad time we must obey. I don't think he's inconsistent. I think he's the most optimistic and hopeful of all these characters, and he's facing the truth of the broken world at the end of the play. So I ask, what do these lines communicate about the nature of the world in which the characters of the play live, but it's also the world in which we live? Many readers consider King Lear to be among the bleakest of Shakespeare's tragedies. which is saying something. That makes it one of the bleakest things ever written. Do you agree that it's this bleak? But moreover, what are we supposed to do with the bleak, broken world of King Lear? This next question is perhaps the most challenging question we can ever ask. And I think King Lear poses it to audiences, and that's why one of the greatest plays ever. Is this fallen, broken world that Edgar sees at the end of the play, is that all the universe has to offer? Or does this play gesture to the existence of something greater than the broken world that we occupy? This is one of the most studied plays of all time. If you look for scholarly articles on it, you'll find hundreds of thousands. Not everyone, maybe not most people who read this play, believe there's a world greater than the broken world in which we live. But they still read it. Why? Why read something this bleak if it doesn't point to something better? These are my thoughts. They scratch the surface. I am so looking forward to reading your thoughts. I hope you've enjoyed Lear as much as I have, and that you're able to take something from it that is wonderful for you. And thank you for listening.